Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Jonny Shipp. I'm the chair of the Internet Commission, which I founded just over 2 years ago. We convened today's Digital Technology Sector Symposium together with the International Network for the Delivery of Regulation at Oxford University, Technological University Dublin and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thanks to all our supporters from business, academia and civil society, our first accountability reporting cycle is well underway, with 6 organisations forming our first cohort. Their internal procedures for digital responsibility are the subject of an accountability report which we will publish later this year. Many of those involved are with us for today's symposium, so I'd like to say a huge thank you for your contributions today, but also for your wider support for the Internet Commission's mission to advance digital responsibility through independent evaluation. It's now my great pleasure to introduce your host for today, the Irish journalist and broadcaster, Jonathan Healy. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, how are you? Good to see you, and you are very welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this online symposium today, organised by the Internet Commission, TU Dublin and INDR. Now, there was a master plan, of course, and that master plan was to have you all to come to Dublin to have a very enjoyable time, but regrettably, COVID-19 had other plans. So we are going to have to ask you to use your imagination somewhat this afternoon to pretend that you are in Dublin. You're looking forward to a lovely pint of Guinness, and tomorrow you may even stroll through the library at Trinity College, Dublin. So the internet, thankfully, has allowed us to do the next best thing, which is to bring people from across the world together online. So we have got a very interesting format set out for the afternoon, which I will bring you the details on in just a minute. But some housekeeping, please note we are indeed, as you can see, making a recording of the webinar, and that by participating, you are agreeing for your contribution to be recorded and to be made available online later for those who were indeed unable to join us live. So what have we got over the course of the next 2 hours? Well, we've got some very interesting discussions, 4 panels to look forward to. The first is going to talk about digitalization and society. What are the key societal impacts and challenges that are resulting from digitalization? We're going to talk about ethical business practice, a very important topic in the current environment. How are organizations adapting to ensure that they're the ones who are making that positive contribution? We're going to take a short break then. That is at 6 o'clock Brussels time, 5 o'clock Dublin/London time, 12 o'clock New York time, and 1 o'clock Sao Paulo time. So there's a whole lot of time zones going on as well, as you might imagine. The third panel, which comes up after that, will be an accountability and content curation. What are the best practices that are emerging? Who's doing it well out of the millions of companies that are actually engaging in this space, and how can it be evaluated? We're going to talk about shaping the future agenda, coordinating the actions as best they can be coordinated. How is that planned and regulated? And as Jonny said, we are going to bring together many of the Internet Commission's visionary supporters from business, from academia, from civil society. If you are new to the Internet Commission, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this discussion today, and hopefully you will continue to be involved in bringing forward their mission of advancing digital responsibility through independent evaluation. A very important job to do in the current world that we live in. So anyway, as they would say here, COVID be damned. It's delighted to see you all in such good form and with us here today, and see the participants all after joining us from right around the globe. Let us turn our attention maybe to our first panel, ladies and gentlemen. That is on digitalization and society. And it is the opportunity to remind you that this is in fact an interactive event. So if you want to take part in the question and answer session, do so using the Q&A box, which is below you on the screen, whether you're using a mobile phone or you're watching us via laptop. So you can put your questions through that system and they will make it as far as me, and I will ask them of our panelists as they appear. So what are the key social impacts and challenges that are resulting from digitalization, of which there is so much going on around the globe at every second of every hour? Our speakers include Professor Brian O'Neill. He's the Director of Research at the Technological University of Dublin. In 2014, he undertook an independent assessment of internet safety for 16 companies represented in the ICT Coalition, and he's now a member of the Internet Commission's Advisory Board. Brian, good afternoon to you. Good to see you. It would be great to bring everybody to Dublin, but unfortunately that plan didn't quite come off.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm so sorry about that. We're delighted here in TU Dublin to be associated with this, and many thanks to the Internet Commission for coordinating and bringing it all together. Yes, indeed. Certainly, this is a really important topic. Dublin's a really important venue, I suppose, to host discussions like this, and that was certainly our objective, whereby people across the technology sector in the public policy arena could focus on these kinds of issues.
Well, and it's great as well that Technological University Dublin has had a great couple of months with the news that you've had, and it would be it's a real pity we can't get to see it in person, but we'll get there. We will get there another day, guaranteed.
In future, we'll reconvene this time next year in person.
In person. Our next panelist is Sonia Livingston. She is a professor of social psychology at the London School of Economics. She's political science and leading authority on children, media and the internet. She's a recipient of many honours and advisor to European and international institutions on children's internet safety and rights in the digital environment. Sonia, we'd invite you to turn your camera on as well and join us. And Bojana Bellamy is the president of the Centre for Information Policy Leadership, which has pioneered organisational accountability for more than a decade. Also a member of the Internet Commission's Advisory Board, Bojana is a leading expert in corporate compliance systems, as well as data privacy and cyber security law and privacy. You're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us all. I suppose we will delve in. We've got your instructions there, but maybe let's begin, Brian, with you, if we may. Societal impacts and the challenges from digitalization. Everything is being digitized. Everything. We are creating data lakes that are of immeasurable depth. What are the societal risks and challenges posed by that level of data collection?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Jonathan, because nothing really illustrates this, quite like the current situation, in terms of, just how deep our digital transformation now is. We have massively demonstrated our reliance on digital technologies to make things happen, to connect, communicate, and to do so, quite effectively in many ways. So with all of that, the deepening of digitalization means that we use so much more, we access so much more, we gain all the benefits, but with that, the exposure to potential risk or things going wrong, or ways in which it works against us, that also increases. So we're having to attune to that type of situation. So in terms of where this finds its footprint in terms of what the impact may be, there are all of the issues that we have been dealing with for many, many years. In fact, we've participants on the panel today, can speak with a long experience of, how we've been trying to tackle content issues, both illegal content, harmful content, all of the issues around communications, which has, been both positive and which works in negative ways, and hampers our ability to work effectively.
Sonia, if I can turn to you, this is a cross-generational issue now. It's very interesting we're having this conversation, because I had a very interesting conversation with my 12-year-old about what he was putting online and making sure that he was aware that he was digitizing things about himself, and how that all of a sudden could lead to problems if he didn't manage it properly. We are struggling with the social impacts on digitalization for children and for families, given the volume and the normality of it these days.
Right, we absolutely are. And, I think now that today children are digital by default. They don't have an opportunity to live a life in a way that isn't digital. So it worries me in a way that we adults tend to judge them when they do go online. We worry when they do go online, and we criticize very often what the opportunities are. We say blithely there are many opportunities available for young people, but the opportunities they find, the opportunities they want, we don't necessarily support or even understand. So very often one hears from children, perhaps as illustrated by your son, you kind of observe he's online, you criticize in a sense, if I may, for you know, how much he's online, how much
I very much do.
online.
You're right there.
Right.
That's not a lie.
So I think, you know, what I try to do in my research, and many people who work on children and young people, is really try to listen to what their concerns are and what they want us adults to grasp about why they play games, why they need to be in touch with their friends all the time. It isn't just fluff, it isn't just time wasting, it is really their connections, their identity, their sense of belonging.
And that has become, Bojana, a really strong focal point in the last 3 months. We have seen this massive rush online from those who were used to doing it and those who found they had no choice but to do it. And that spans the generations. I mean, I've spoken with my mother on FaceTime today, and I've spoken with my child on video as well. So that just means that everybody is doing this. And the real challenge is COVID-19 has meant that we've had to effectively rewrite the digital agenda in some way because of the rush.
Absolutely. So absolutely. In fact, you know, I often talk about us living a real life case study for all of those of you, Brian and Sonia, professors, right? It's like writing, you couldn't have written a better case study on how the society and world has changed. A really digital acceleration has just taken off and there is not going back. So whatever has happened now is going to stay. And kind of a couple of things I want to offer. First of all, there were a lot of discussions, right, around this crisis, specifically, how do we manage the crisis in a way that enables public health, use of data collection and sharing, but also protecting privacy. And in fact, if you looked at the media, particularly at the beginning, it was always like, oh, we are living in the September 11 sort of situation. We have to sacrifice our privacy and other rights, digital rights, because of public safety. And I really got upset with those discussions because I really think we need both. It's not one or the other. In order to, in fact, fight this pandemic and to live in this new world, we have absolutely got to achieve both protection of people, their data, their rights, but also enabling data collection, data sharing, data use in a responsible, accountable way. And we at CIPL have written this op-ed where we're kind of saying, here is how our 12 accountability measures where you can actually do this in an accountable way. The second thing I wanted to mention, Jonathan, is that we've seen a real impact of this COVID situation on all players. And maybe I can maybe talk a little bit about organizations and regulators, because they're kind of very important in this world, right? So organizations had to completely reimagine how they work, how they communicate, how they deliver their services, reimagine their workforce and workplace, and of course, not just to deal with the crisis, but to return. And this is, of course, raising all kinds of new issues from all of us working from home, new cybersecurity threats, new digital threats. We had to reimagine how we serve our customers, their new companies, new disruptors, new kids on the block. And again, you know, are they ready to pass this stress test in terms of digital responsibility?
And I suppose we have had quite a rush to do things, and we've seen that's played out in some stories online. Brian, if I can put to you, I mean, you've done a lot of work to evaluate industry responses to the challenges that are thrown up. I mean, what conclusions can you draw about what's required? Because when you do things in a crisis, that's never a great starting point, but also you learn things in a crisis. And from what you've seen that's gone before, are we in a better place now to I suppose, to guide industry on how you should respond rather than doing what you're doing and hoping for the best?
Yeah, I hope that is the case, you know, because I think, you know, there is quite a lot of experience in terms of, you know, having been down this road. We've been tackling a range of problems that are really, you know, quite persistent, and, you know, they're thorny issues, but we have tried things. And now, if you like, the imperative and the impetus to do that is never greater. I hope there are benefits to all of this. Bojana has mentioned some of them. It is about accountability, and now there's a recognition of the need for accountability by all stakeholders. stakeholders. So creating the conditions for that. Transparency is a very important part of that. We're talking about building trust. So, that means that we have the basis on which to really give a foundation for that trust, so we can see the evidence. So, part of our work is, as researchers, is trying to build the independent evidence base around decisions that are made, and that is information that should be widely shared. So I think, something else that the pandemic is showing is the value of openness in terms of research and information. So, there is an opportunity now, and, coinciding with some really important decisions around the regulatory space, because, that's what this year really has brought up. And now is the opportunity to grasp that. Multi-stakeholder cooperation has been one of, I think, the success points, but perhaps, we have not really given it the kind of force that it needs. And, those are some of the opportunities now, I would think.
But should we, look, responsibility is the key word here. And it is easy for me, and I've used the phrase when I'm on air, the idea that the internet is the Wild West. It is almost beyond responsibility and accountability. And I know, look, in Dublin, we have got all of the European headquarters of all of these organizations, and the responsibility to police them all falls to the Irish regulator. Is it possible to have responsibility in a system that was almost built in an absence of it?
Well, I'm not quite sure if that's entirely true. I think, yes, we have legion examples of lack of responsibility, but in fairness to all players, these are high stakes issues, and there's a lot of, very serious attention given to how to build trustworthy, responsible frameworks. Now, the emphasis around Dublin, yes, we are in a very unique position, where we host companies and data. There are major obligations on, Irish agencies acting on behalf of our European counterparts. So, that itself is, again, something that needs a lot of cooperation across the board about thinking about, what will actually work. And that is in itself, the incentive, I think, to build the responsibility.
Sonia, if I can bring you in at this point, society is built in such a way that we protect everybody as best we can, particularly the young and the vulnerable. Are they giving due consideration to the vulnerable when we are considering how to digitalize everything, how to make sure that it is regulated properly? I mean, are children and the vulnerable an afterthought that we have to try and patch rather than making sure that those protections are built at the heart of what we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're an afterthought, and sometimes not even an afterthought. And we still think of the vulnerable as the minority. But I think, as we've all discovered during COVID, if we, think about children, we think about the elderly, we think about, many people don't want to be called vulnerable, but many people for whom special accommodations are needed. So I'd include people with disabilities or people for whom English is a second language. You start adding it up and you really see that the internet is built for, if I may, able-bodied, white, wealthy men. And everyone else is somehow struggling. And what we're seeing from research is trust is really plummeting. We are going backwards from building a trustworthy environment. And what I hear from children in research is that they really want to be included in that discussion. They have the right to their own voice, and they have a lot to offer, because very often, they're 1 in 3 of the internet users in the world, and they are still the canaries in the coal mine. They are still the first on the new platform, the first who are discovering the latest app that we adults haven't even thought about, let alone begun to regulate. And they are out there experiencing a lot of the problems that, if we listened, we could be much smarter as adults in building a more responsive and respectful internet.
So it was always thus that the adults never listened to the children and then wondered what went wrong afterwards. It's a very valid point. Bojana, I mean, we've seen differing regulations around the world. And that's a unique challenge for bigger companies that operate in multiple markets, that the regulation can differ from one side to the other. Is there ever a possibility we'll get to a one-size-fits-all program for digital corporate responsibility?
Right. So we will never have one law, but I think we must not underestimate the ability of these same multinationals that we are very often quick to put in front of the gun barrel to actually push the market, push the best practices, and export, if you like, the level of protection globally. Funny enough, we have now published just a report on kind of looking at accountability practices of 17 global organizations, and what we have found is that in fact they do try to behave in the same way, so no matter where they operate. And I really do hope there is a chance for that. So I would like to see regulators sort of embrace this and encourage and promote and support those sort of companies that are trying to be digitally responsible. I think in post-COVID world, some people have said we're going to see less of this because there's not going to be enough money to do the right thing. I completely disagree. Just for the reasons that Sonia, you have talked about, we have this trust deficit. The world has moved to digital, and those organizations that understand that in order to succeed, you have to provide that digital responsibility, just like you do ESG, right, for investors. And so now it's going to be digital at the end of ESG. So I really do hope that all the other organizations emulate that. We see the race to the top, right, in the marketplace, and the competition, right, on these issues as well.
How much of a challenge is it, Bojana, that we have a situation where everywhere the state tries to intervene, it sometimes can result in the wrong action, because those who create the technology are always going to be ahead. Those who are trying to somehow otherwise catch up will always be behind. So our state's always at a constant disadvantage of playing catch up and not quite understanding the full landscape.
Right, I'm afraid yes, and that is exactly because of the thing that Brian said. We need to, as state and government, we now need to regulate and make policy in this multi-stakeholder way. We have to be informed in order to make better. And this digital world kind of makes everybody a bit of schizophrenic. Here is what I have in mind. In organizations, you know, sometimes you think data is toxic. I have to get rid of it. It brings compliance costs, it brings issues, but also data is an opportunity. In governments as well, governments are not sure what to do. They want to push the AI, they want to push the digital agenda, they want to push digital enablement, but then they also worry about harm, quite rightly. They worry about digital sovereignty. Where is data? Where is data? Who has access to data? How do we ensure access to data within our own country, right? So we want at the same time share data, but also keep it within. And so, you know, governments, states have to be a bit more sophisticated, right? We all have to move to this digital way of thinking and regulating and policy making as opposed to the old-fashioned.
Therein lies the conundrum, Brian. How do we do that? Because the state wants to welcome all of these companies with all that they could possibly bring in terms of employment and advancement for the people who live within the state. And at the same time, they're terrified that the wrong thing may be done in the state and those people may be put at risk. It's a very fine balance, isn't it?
It is. It is. But I think, you know, in Ireland in particular, we're a small country, and you know, we've been good at negotiating. And I think, you know, we do have an ability to get parties around the table. I think the difference is that, you know, this is not just, you know, a local interest. We act in a European and we act globally. So that, if you like, you know, we're doing it, you know, on behalf of all European citizens in terms of our regulatory functions, in terms of our global participation, and you know, Ireland's you know, activity and participation at the UN level has now received you know, a major boost. So, you know, in that context, I think we look to the role of the state as being a broker, and you're a broker between the parties. You've got to assume the responsibilities that states really do need to. There is a definite role and you know, a new emphasis on the regulatory function on the part of the state. But how you now achieve that, you've got to, you know, work with all the forces available to you to bring that multi-stakeholder dialogue and agreement on the roadmap ahead.
I want to bring you in on that if I can, please, Bojana.
Yes, again, COVID is a great example of how really the boundaries between state and private are being blurred. We have to ask ourselves, what is the role of some of these big digital companies and platforms who frankly enabled us, including Zoom, to survive this stuff, right? And government has been now more dependent on some of these digital players to actually create tools and apps and enable this data sharing. So we really need a different mindset where we are now, there isn't this hierarchy, but we are really players at the same level, and public-private partnership has to be absolutely coming forward. And innovative tools like regulatory sandbox, this to me is something that has been pioneered in the UK, of course the FCA, but now the Information Commissioner. We are seeing the Norwegian regulator. I'd love the Data Privacy Commissioner of Ireland to also kick this off, but we're talking about that in European data space as well. We need these regulatory sandbox, new ways of constructive engagement, and this responsible experimentation within these sandboxes, right, to actually be deployed a little bit more in this new world.
I love the way we brought sandboxes into it. I can understand that as the outsider. I'm fully on board now. Sonia, if I could just ask a question of you. There's a wonderful expression. It's based in a joke here in Ireland, where somebody stops a man on the road for directions and he goes, "I don't know where you're going, but I wouldn't start from here," as if somehow that would be of use to you as you're trying to reach your destination. Do we have that approach to digitalization, that we are starting in the wrong place in many ways, and that we could be and should be doing it better?
Well, we definitely could be and should be doing it better. And if we knew where we were going to be today, I think 20 years ago, we might have started in a different place. And I think there's many of us who have spent 10 or so years arguing for a self-regulatory and multi-stakeholder approach, who are now feeling actually that was a path that we wasted a lot of time on. So, but on the other hand, you know, we do have to start where we are. And while I'm completely in sympathy with redrawing the whole map, there's also a lot of incredibly practical things that can be done, that are feasible, that could be done right away. And if I just, you know, I was reading earlier Ofcom's new research on online harms, which came out for the UK yesterday. 9 in 10 adults and children, between 8 and 9 in 10, are worried about what is going to happen to them online. Only a minority are reporting or doing anything about it when something goes wrong. Half of them haven't heard if there was any result of what happened when they did report it. You know, I think there's just a lot of things that we can do to explain to people better, to signpost people better, to be more responsive when they do express a concern, and to make sure that they're getting the outcomes. Any consumer field would do this. Okay. You know, why is this one not?
Folks, it's been a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much for joining us. Professor Brian O'Neill from the Technological University Dublin, Sonia Livingston from the London School of Economics, and Bojana Bellamy from the Centre for Information Policy Leadership. I have to give you a round of applause on behalf of everybody. We assume all the people who are at home watching us are doing the same. Thank you so much. I'll leave you turn off your cameras. And thank you for joining us this afternoon and sharing your thoughts. Interesting conversation and more to come. I'd like to thank Brian and Sonia and Mark for what they've said. Don't forget, if you are on what we refer to in this country as the Twitter machine, please use the hashtag digital responsibility if you're posting. And don't forget to use the Internet Commission handle as well, at INET Commission. If you have a question you want to ask, or if you just want to tell people wherever you are in the world what is going on where you are, please do so, and we'll have a look at those tweets as they roll in throughout the day. Now, don't forget, this is a Q&A session as well. Down the bottom of the screen, we have those questions and answers that you can click on, and those Q&As will come up on the screen and I'll be able to answer them. So please do interact and get going on that. Chris has joined us already, but before we join you, Chris, we're going to ask people to participate in a poll. So here is the poll that we want to ask you. If we can throw it up on the screen, you're right, hopefully everyone will be able to see that. And it is based on our first conversation. Can the internet ever be truly regulated? And the options we have given you there are: yes, it can; yes, but with difficulty; no, it cannot; it already is; and I don't know. So let's get people voting on that poll. We're going to give that 30 or 40 seconds. Just let people click on that and see the kind of response that we've got. Again, yeah, you're flying in. There's no problem with using technology. Eric Wan will be delighted that Zoom and the Q&A session and the polls are working very well. We've got 64% of the vote, nearly reaching the end to close it off. If the rest of you can just get those votes in quickly, and we'll be able to do that. Yeah, let's park it there. You're right. There we have it. Can the internet ever be truly regulated? Yes, 19%. Yes, but with difficulty, 47%. No, it cannot, 17%. 13% are living in the situation where they believe it already is, and 4% are like me, and they say they just do not know. So thank you very much for participating in that. Yes, but with difficulty is the majority opinion there, which is why we are taking part in this conversation today. So don't forget, after our next panel, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to be resuming then at 5 o'clock Dublin, London time, 6 o'clock Brussels, 12 New York, and 1 o'clock Sao Paulo. And we're also going to be sharing a very special message with you this afternoon from the UN Under-Secretary General, Fabrizio Hochschild, who is the man leading the UN's very important work on digital cooperation. So you do want to stay around for that. But on to our second panel, which is a discussion on ethical business practice. How are organizations adapting to ensure a positive contribution? With me now is Christopher Hodges, who is Professor of Justice Systems at the Centre for Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Oxford. He's also on the Internet Commission's Advisory Board and is a founding member of the INDR. Chris, good afternoon to you, sir. Good to have you with us. Jared Syne is the Chief Legal Officer and Secretary for Match Group, which operates popular dating apps, including Meetic and Tinder. He leads compliance with global privacy and consumer protection regulations and the establishment of safety, security and risk standards. I've never been on Tinder, so I have absolutely no idea how it works, but I'm sure that might come up during the conversation. And our last panelist here, if we can invite her to turn her camera on, Isabel Mitchell, who is a senior officer at Share Action, a charity working to make the investment system a force for good. Isabel wrote Share Action's recent briefing about responsible investment in the age of information with a brilliant title that I absolutely love, Do Androids Dream of Responsible Investment? And I really hope they do. I mean, what else could you want for an Android other than having that when they eventually power down in the evening? Christopher, if I can turn to you first of all, you're an expert in regulatory systems. Where are we at right now? Because we just heard the conversation that went before, but the current state of regulation, how would you describe it?
Well, I think there's quite an interesting evolution occurring in regulatory practice and design. The first point is that the traditional model of regulation has usually, if it's formal regulation, state regulation, involved making rules and then an authority that enforces them. Now, there are various assumptions in that. In particular, the assumption of why enforcement works or doesn't work has come under a great deal of research and scrutiny. For example, the theory from classical legal philosophy and economic theory that deterrence affects behavior, in the regulatory context at the very least, has come under enormous attack. And if one looks at behavioral psychology, we understand why people obey laws intrinsically and how you can encourage that, and why some people break them predictably in some circumstances because of pressures or social requirements or targets or all sorts of stupid things when they don't intend to. So the question of how the design of the system and how you create it in practice have all evolved. Now, the other part is it formal regulation, state regulation, or is it self-regulation, or something in the middle as co-regulation? Well, coming out of the last discussion, we saw the point coming out again and again about people saying, well, actually, everyone needs to be involved in this. You know, children want and should be involved. They're users. We've moved beyond the 1960s idea of ask consumers. Actually, everyone should be involved. So that raises a question, for example, about, well, who should make the laws? Should it be a parliament? Have you got a children's parliament, for example? Well, what's the forum for getting everyone together and getting all the responses in? And it may well be feedback mechanisms like platforms or ombuds or whatever.
The implication being it's all catch up, isn't it? I mean, we're all always trying to catch up and stay ahead of something that is constantly evolving. And when you have a moving target like that, it's tricky.
Well, some systems are further ahead than this, and they've done it, and they've evolved more quickly. So I slightly despair when I see systems like the EU GDPR, for example, which is for me an old-fashioned model.
It's had its birthday. Just be
Quite, but it's an enforcement-based model, and it assumes that very large fines will lead to 100% compliance. I don't believe there's any evidence for that. I'm sure Bojana would be delighted to hear me say that, but it's an old-fashioned model. Now, the other concept that's going on in regulation is you don't just think of designing things in terms of rules and enforcement. You think in terms of regulatory delivery, which, and there's a good book on that, written largely by officials, saying, does it work? What are the outcomes? What are the objectives that we're trying to do, which is usually both protection and facilitation, if you like, but in a context within which we've got adequate protection. So what are the outcomes? Now, as soon as you start thinking in those terms, the previous assumptions about rules and parliaments and regulators and enforcement go out of the window, because you say, well, what works? So huge, therefore, periods of perhaps experimentation, picking up the sandbox point, and people trying new things, especially looking at organizational cultures.
Okay, well, let's talk about new things, because the dating sector obviously was one that used to be traditional for centuries, and then along came the likes of Tinder that completely changed it. And not only did it change it, it opened it up to personal information being shared in a way that it had never been shared before. Jared, for you guys, I mean, obviously it's been an interesting couple of weeks, but in general, how does Match Group as an entity then try and coordinate responsible corporate citizenship across so many different markets? I mean, not you've GDPR to worry about, but then you've all the other regulations to worry about as well, yet the product has to effectively remain the same. Oh, we'll turn the mic on. That does help.
Yeah, there we go. I got the mic back on. It's a challenge for sure when you've got a global company like we're operating that has to be true to its product, true to its roots in terms of giving the same experience effectively to users across the globe. It's a big challenge, particularly as you watch different governments and different regulatory bodies try and tackle this in different ways. The way we've tried to think about it is, first, it's important that we engage, right? If we're not engaged in the conversation, if we're not engaged in the dialogue, people can't understand the concerns, the risks, the needs, all those things of our specific industry, of our specific business. So engagement is incredibly important, not just with regulators and policymakers, but also with other players in the industry, other players within the tech space in general, to make sure that we have a good sense of how people are thinking about this, the way they're attacking it. And then we can help represent some of those ideas as we speak with and work with regulators and policymakers, et cetera. But then once you're at that place and once laws are getting passed, they're not all consistent. Many of these regimes are inconsistent. You know, you have regimes in the US and you have regimes in the EU, and you've got regimes in APAC. You've got all these different regimes. And so what we've tried to do is effectively look at all these regimes and say, can we establish a common baseline out of these regimes? So for instance, take privacy. We've essentially said, you know what, we want our users across the globe to have a similar level of rights and access and all those things as it relates to privacy. And so we look at GDPR and kind of say, okay, that's a baseline, but over here you've got some things in APAC that are different. Over here you've got CCPA in the US that's been passed, and that's a little bit different. And here are things that other countries like Brazil are looking at doing. And so how do we kind of incorporate that into a framework that, you know, first and foremost, make sure our users have a great private experience, but even more, maybe not more importantly, but equally importantly, making sure that we're complying with all these various piecework regimes that exist.
Is probably the common driver across every jurisdiction is that your reputation will be damaged if something goes wrong, and data that you hold on behalf of somebody else for whatever purpose enters the public domain.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, making sure that our users have a safe and trusted experience on our platform, it's massive, right? It really cuts through everything that we do, thinking about that individual user. Do they feel safe? Do they believe their data is protected? Do they believe that it's private? Can they get access to it when they need to, right? That has a huge impact on how we think about what we do. I mean, you look at our business model, which is a lot different than many of the other online tech platforms, but we have a business model where the vast majority, 98+% of our revenue comes from subscriptions. So users have to have a great experience. They have to have a safe experience, and they have to have a trusted experience, or they're not going to pay us and they're not going to come back. And so for us, safety and privacy kind of cuts into everything and really leads us in the direction we go.
Isabel, can I turn to you? Investors as well, they're probably another significant driving force in all of this, because again, going back to that reputation idea as being one of the key drivers, but also nobody wants to invest in something that is ultimately going to fall over the fact that they haven't done something properly. How are investors thinking in this space when they are looking at putting their money into a brand or into a startup or into any kind of organization?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I certainly hope they are a driving force in improving the impact of digitalisation on society. And just want to say I'm very pleased you enjoyed the title of the book. We've got another Philip K. Dick fan in the house. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I work at Share Action, which is a charity that campaigns for responsible investment in the investment industry, which very, very broadly can be defined as the inclusion of environmental, social, or corporate governance considerations into investment decisions, either for financial or for ethical reasons. So I'm not an investor myself, but sort of here to represent the responsible investors who care about the societal challenges around digitalisation that we've been discussing here, and trying to use their shareholder voice to improve some of these impacts that we've discussed.
Does it work? I mean, have people, is there actual evidence that that kind of ethical shareholding has an impact on companies that may have decided to go in a direction that mightn't be described as the best?
I'd say certainly yes. So responsible investment around digitalisation specifically is a very new topic. It's an emerging topic that investors are only just starting to get their head around. So there's a few examples of investors engaging in this space, but not quite so much as we have sort of around climate change and other more mainstream topics. But this is, so within my role at Share Action, I work with a group of charities called the Charities Responsible Investment Network. And they're working to align their invested assets with their missions through responsible investments. And just to say a little bit more about why that's important to them, it's say your charity's mission is to improve society in some way, so inequality, through your grant giving or your operational activities. But on the other hand, your investments, which help fund your work on inequality, might be going to companies that in some way are exacerbating that. So there's a bit of conflict there between the impact of your mission and the unintended impacts of your investments. So with our charities, we're trying to, that's what we mean by mission-aligned investment, using your investments as a tool to further your mission rather than conflict against it.
Christopher, can I ask you, I mean, do this ethical cultural approach, could it work? I mean, could it be a way that, you know, we see investment making sure that the right kind of action is taken by these companies when it comes to digitization, data, and privacy?
Yes, well, I think there are already quite a number of encouraging examples where it has worked. And there are elements in existing, if you like, old-fashioned regulatory or corporate systems where some of it is working and can be developed. So let me start in a slightly different place. It seems to me at the moment that it's a given that human beings achieve most when they cooperate. So the question is, how do you cooperate? The answer is basically trust. Trust is built on evidence. All the philosophers, and O'Neill, for example, said that wonderfully, and Francis Fukuyama said it decades ago. So what is the evidence of trust? So those are the regulatory discussions that are now going on in building that question, answering that question, as opposed to just, oh, we comply with a number of laws. It's now look at your entire culture and say, what do you do holistically? And within that context, there are new ideas of it's a development of CSR and ESG and sustainability and long term. And actually the same sorts of questions, I believe, are now being asked by the business community, like BlackRock and all the rest of it. Love to talk to Isabel about that. But I think that it's exactly the same questions they're asking. tell us about your culture. Is it ethical? Can we trust you to do the right thing? In which case, you're a low risk for regulation and society. You're a low risk for investors, and therefore you ought to do well. People should be happy working there and selling, etc. So, and that's all built up by a huge amount of behavioral psychology.
Can I put a question to you that's come in? And I suppose it's possibly relevant to what you're saying from Chad. Do you put any merit on the GDPR opening up actions to not-for-profits like Max Schrems, My Privacy is None of Your Business, and attempting to introduce a class action? It's a pluralistic approach to enforcement. Could it work for the future? It's opening up action beyond regulators. Could that be one way, Christopher, that we could see
I'm intrinsically not a fan of private enforcement, because it seems to me that it's rather, as a distinguished American professor said several decades ago, this is one load of investors trying to take money from another load of investors at its worst. And I'm much more in favor of other systems of resolution that involve ombudsmen and regulators and others. And I don't believe that private enforcement, because it's based on deterrence, as I said earlier, actually affects behavior in the way that more sophisticated approaches like involvement of shareholders and regulators can do that.
Jared, can I ask you, as somebody who's coming at it from your perspective, a company, again, we talked about reputation, and that's a great enforcer, but if you had an opportunity to do it, given what you have learned and what you know about how Match is operated, and if somebody asked you as a benevolent force, what would you do to actively change this space?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the way that I would think about this is it is helpful to have voices in the room. So, one thing that was mentioned is investors. It's interesting. I was on a couple of calls this past week with investors where they're asking these important questions about these important topics. How are you as Match Group thinking about these, handling these, things like data monetization? For a company like ours, we've got a good answer. We don't sell data, so that's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. But I do think it's important that you have voices in the room. One of the ways we've kind of seen this work really well in our business is we've developed our own external advisory council on safety. And so we have members of this committee who are experts in the fields of online safety, et cetera. And what we've been able to do as an organization is come up with what we think is the best, go to that advisory council. They are able to then kind of review what we're doing, insert their knowledge, their understanding, their best practices to take us up to that next level, and then validate the other things that we're doing. So our safety practices get better and better and better. Same on privacy and other things. And the reality is, as governments think about regulating, number one, I think there has to be more coordination amongst governments, because at the end of the day, it becomes impossible for businesses to try and navigate 20, 30, 50, 100 different sets of rules. So that's one thing. But two, there needs to be some kind of, I don't know if it's council or how you think about it, but there have to be these bodies that have a role, that are out there in the world, that actually see how things operate, that can come in and validate and can give suggestions. Without these bodies, putting in static, flat laws are not going to keep up with technology. We've seen that happen. And as a result, we're going to be in the same place 20 years from now.
But how do you enforce that? And Isabel, I'm going to come to you on this as well. But how do you enforce that? You've got well-intentioned groups that have been set up by either by industry or ethical investors or whoever to say this is the way we should do it, and this is the right way. And then it comes to enforcement, and what stops an unethical company going, who cares?
Look, I think these organizations have to be empowered to be able to put edicts out, and if businesses don't follow them, it's got to go beyond just the fines. We've seen the large players just kind of take the fines in stride and keep running. It has to be more enforcement in terms of not being able to operate in certain places, or having other aspects of your business impacted as a result of it. But I would tend to agree with Professor Hodges. Just enforcement fines don't work. We haven't seen them work at all.
Okay, Isabel, last word to you on this. What do you think is the biggest action that needs to be taken now to ensure that the type of ethical investment that you've talked about as one way moving forward, that can spread as a force for good across the globe?
Yeah, of course. I think the main barrier at the moment for ethical investors to engage on digitalization is this conception that it's the technical nature that they'll have to be engaging with. I don't think they feel like they understand the issues enough to be prepared to challenge companies on these issues. it can be difficult to know what best practice is and therefore what to ask for. So going back to the sort of analogy I mentioned with climate change earlier, now that that's a mainstream responsible investment topic, we have lots of third-party metrics and frameworks and regulations surrounding that investors can pull on and use to have these conversations with company management. So I think the growing body of benchmarks and frameworks surrounding digitalization, one that's been used by investors before is the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index, but also the framework that the Internet Commission are developing at the moment will be really key to giving investors the confidence to be able to build coalitions and engage with companies.
And I suppose, and a badge that they can put on their company that says, at least we've done and been working to do the right thing. Folks, it's been another interesting conversation. Isabel Mitchell, Senior Officer with Share Action, Professor Christopher Hodges, Professor at University of Oxford, and Jared Syme, Chief Legal Officer and Secretary of MatchGov. I still didn't ask you how Tinder works, but I'm sure it works fine. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. We'll allow you to turn your cameras and your mics off at this point. And in fact, we are reached the point where we've got a little 10-minute break, but don't stray too far from your screen, because we've got little bits and pieces coming up over the next 10 minutes that will be of interest to you. But we have the opportunity maybe to take time to have a cup of tea or get a glass of water or whatever you want to do, because in a few minutes we're going to have a very special message that was recorded by the UN Under Secretary General Fabrizio Hochschild, who leads the important work in digital cooperation. Keep the tweets coming, and we're very grateful for the people who are tweeting so far. Do keep them coming in with the hashtag digital responsibility and at INET Commission. If you have a question that specifically you would like to ask, please do have them coming in, and we look forward to recapping at the very end using the Zoom Q&A webinar. So part 2 begins in 10 minutes time approximately. We will see you back live at that point, but in the meantime, have a little break and we'll talk to you shortly.
You might not have heard of it before, but digital cooperation affects who has access to the internet, how affordable it is, and what people see online. It affects how safe they are from the threat of harassment, cyber attack, or unlawful surveillance. Now, this can depend on where in the world you live, your gender, the color of your skin, what job you do, whether you have a disability or not, and other attributes that should not disadvantage anyone anywhere. Half of the world's population still does not have access to the internet, which makes existing inequalities between people and peoples worse, much worse. Meanwhile, online violence and harassment are growing, especially since the COVID pandemic hit. Unsurprisingly, women and children are harder hit than men. Depending where you are, you might be exposed to violent or abusive content online in the name of freedom of speech, or conversely, you might be completely lacking freedom of speech online. Tracking apps may have saved thousands of lives where you are, or they may have needlessly encroached on your privacy. These are just some of the issues and discrepancies that we face in the digital era. Global cooperation across borders, across government, industry, and civil society is indispensable to ensuring that these issues are addressed communally for all people around the world, and we don't end up with a fragmented collection of internets with different rules and different liberties. We need together to come up with appropriate, common global rules of the road to navigate our digital future. No one country or community can handle these issues alone. Through digital cooperation, we can build technologies and online spaces that encourage peace and dignity, not hate and violence, that serve the public, not only profit, and that include and benefit everyone, everywhere.
And that was the UN Under Secretary General Fabrizio Hochschild, who's leading the UN's very important work on digital cooperation, with a very key message there about how the world treats data and treats everything that goes on differently. Also, during that segment, I had the uncontrollable urge to make a pot. I don't know how that happened, but yet it did. And I'd like to thank whoever put that in through that particular segment. You're welcome back, everybody. This is the second part of this seminar, which, as we know, should be taking place in Dublin, and you should be enjoying the very best of Irish hospitality. Instead, you've got me. And for those of you who've joined late, my name is Jonathan Healy. I'm a broadcaster in Ireland, and it was my distinct pleasure to be with you today as your master of ceremonies. So what have we got coming up in the next while? Well, we've got our next panel on accountability and content curation, about best practices that are emerging and how they can be evaluated. Our final panel will be discussing coordinated actions that have been planned and required as we look to shape the future agenda, and we have a final wrap up as well on what has gone before us here this afternoon. It's already been very interesting, and lots of different ideas have been thrown up. But let's move on to the accountability and content curation idea. What are the best practices that are emerging? How can they be evaluated? How do we know that the leaders, are the ones who say they're the leaders, are in fact that? With me now, we've got we've got Robert Madeleine, who is British by birth and French by marriage, it has down here, who's been a trade negotiator for over 20 years. He's European Commission Director General for 12. He's a chairman of FIPRA International and advises on all things European Union, including IT, technology, research and innovation, trade and investment. I would like you to turn on your camera, please, Robert, so everybody can see you. We hopefully will speak with Rebecca Newton in just a moment. I believe she is looking to join us very soon. She is with a company called Super Awesome, which I love the name of, if nothing else, and we'll hopefully speak to her. And Julian Coles is the Internet Commission's Policy Director. He's a trustee of ChildNet International, and until 2015 he was responsible for the online editorial policy at the BBC. He's advised Ofcom and the British government on social media policy. Julian, if you can join us as well by turning on your camera, it would be great to see and hear from you. Robert, please don't leave shot, because you're the only guest I have to talk to, so it'll be great to have you back. Let's begin with you, if we can. Look, I'm going back to the idea of ethical self-regulation that we were talking about with our previous panel, Robert. Can it be done? I mean, is that one potential way of doing it?
So one of the interests you didn't declare is I also work in the INDR space, and I do that so very much because I believe that ethical business, doing the right thing, can be grown from the inside out of a firm, whether it's big or small. The second thing I'd say, however, is that it's not going to be enough to do the right thing. You need to consistently show your employees, your board, your regulators, but also the public, your customers, opinion shapers, that you are doing the right thing. And I think one of the missing pieces in what we're thinking about at the moment is how interactively the audience and the doers create the right benchmarks for sound behavior. And I think the sort of what I call the eBay approach, how can there be an interaction around trustworthiness between users and doers? That's the piece to dig deeper on, I think.
Who decides who's a user, who's a doer, who's the right person to do that job?
Well, I think, as Isabel was saying in the previous panel, everybody can be an activist now. So I contribute to a charity. I want to know that the charity is itself an activist investor, and the charity wants to know what the firms whose shares it's holding actually do. So in that sense, I'm a doer if I invest in a charity. A charity does its own stuff, but it's also part of the stakeholder ecosystem for company X.
Julian, good to see you. Thank you. My apologies, there was an issue with the camera there, which was my fault. I'm willing to admit the responsibility now. Companies can volunteer to take part in the evaluation process. Why would they do that?
Is that one for me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there are, I think, just a little bit of context. We in the Internet Commission are running our evaluation process, and we're looking at how Internet companies moderate at scale. So that's the background. And over the last few months, we've been doing case studies with individual global sized companies who have this challenge of moderation at scale. And indeed, it's a very good question. If there's no requirement or obligation on anyone to collaborate with us, no kind of statutory stick to shake at companies, why do they step forward? And I think there are probably three sort of plain answers. They want to be ahead of the curve. They want to be proactive. They are willing to welcome independent scrutiny. And the process they find is of value to their brand and their users. And if I could just kind of elaborate that a little bit. Our first case study gave us feedback a couple of months ago. These are people, one big global company who came to us and we set off together. And they said, you asked the right questions. They weren't all easy, but they were the right ones. The process is timely because there is more scrutiny from regulators and the media, and you generated valuable insights, and you really helped test our thinking. So that's just a sort of microcosm to show, I think, that some people step forward at the moment and some people step back.
But if they don't step forward and we end up having rogue actors within the system who don't want to take part in it, does the system fall apart then as a result?
Then, as people have said, you know, there is a whole, you can go with the heavy stick, but there are other routes. And I think that when Professor Christopher Hughes was talking about trust and culture, that's something that we need to build on. We absolutely need to build on. And I think we are sort of moving in that direction to try and enable this to grow and extend.
Robert, there are so many actors in this play that is literally never ending. How do we get to the point where when the public authority fails to do the right thing, they're blamed? When industry fails to do the right thing, they're blamed. And ultimately, it comes down to a lack of trust across society that somehow we can get this right. How do we get past that?
So I think the real test is whether society itself cares for the things that the people on this seminar think they should care about. In areas like advertising self-regulation, which I see has been part of some of the chat, actually I believe the biggest penalty there is what happens in the market if, for example, the advertising standards people in London say this supermarket chain screwed up. The share price goes down. People notice, and I think we have to focus, therefore, in the internet space on the things that we actually have strong evidence people really care about. And I think that's an important piece to build around a small number of things that people actually care about, rather than a very long list of things where the market and opinion does not actually follow failure with punishment.
It's funny you mentioned the advertising sector. One of my favorite things to do as a journalist was to wait for, in Ireland, the Advertising Standards Authority of Ireland to publish their findings, because inevitably there are cracking stories for a journalist to write about that are hugely damaging to a brand who made an error. Sometimes the error would be intentional because they were trying to get a certain amount of attention, but it is self-regulating and the system works. But that's fine if you're dealing with messaging targeting children or adults or whatever the case may be. But if we're trying to regulate something where the implications of something go wrong are more significant, such as data and so on, maybe that model just won't work. That the stick is what's needed, as Julian said.
Well, in the data space, at least as far as the European Union is concerned, there is a big stick and the fines can be very significant. And the reach is extraterritorial if you lose my data in some other continent. So I absolutely agree that there may be things where you need sovereign power. But in many spaces, I think what you see, and I've seen it myself as a sort of internet user over the last 15 years, is that little by little people begin to be more assertive users, for example, of the major online platforms. And little by little, the major online platforms move. We're seeing now during COVID and disinformation, some very interesting trends of responsiveness. I'm not saying it's all going to come right fast enough. I agree with the UN Deputy Secretary General, whatever he was, that actually doing it together would be a good thing. But frankly, today, between Russia, China, and the US, there is no capacity to have a multilaterally legislated level playing field. So it's going to have to be what people punish internet actors for getting wrong, and then what the certification can do to encourage actors to invest in doing the right thing.
Julian, I'm listening to a very interesting podcast at the moment, which is talking about how one particular company was responding to what was a challenge. There was an issue with an algorithm, and they had to respond to it. The problem for them was that some people said they were moving too slowly, and some people said they were moving too quickly. How concerned are the companies that you've been speaking to? How concerned are they about that? That you're never going to keep everybody happy, but you're still trying to do the right thing.
I think that's something that the people we've been working with care about a great deal, obviously. They are, I mean, they've got a lot of constituencies to work with, a lot of constituencies to deal with. I think just jumping back to, if I may, jumping back to the kind of discussion about statutory regulation and big sticks, there are some real problems with that approach. And I think if you just look at the UK as an example, there was a white paper in October 2017. There's a lot of debate and discussion going on. It may be that legislation comes out in 2023-24. And in the meantime, what happens in the interim? And one of the ideas that that people have had, that I think Christopher Hughes has sort of floated as well, is we are not part of a statutory process. Our process is the good coming together and willing to submit to a proper scrutiny. You could have some form of accreditation from regulators or more formal authorities around the world, so that an organization like the Internet Commission could play a bigger part internationally in evaluating procedural accountability. Now, whether you call that co-regulation or not, in a sense, it's how well does it work is the most important thing rather than the label.
I suppose that the most important element here would be to prevent online harm. And no company would arguably go out to set about doing that. Not at the time it comes about as a result of user misuse rather than design in some platform. Is that probably the easiest place to start if we were to build this kind of system, this kind of trust that needs to be put in?
I don't think actually, I mean, if you're taking a kind of statutory view, then you have to be able to demonstrate levels of harm. You have to be able to demonstrate certain thresholds. And that isn't always particularly easy. And at the moment, what we have, I think a lot of people have said this, the French particularly, there's a kind of extreme asymmetry of information between the companies who have a huge amount of information about what they're doing and public policy people, whether they're regulators, whether they're academic, who are not getting access to this information, or substantially they're not. And without having a good, clear picture of what's happening and the policies and processes and practices behind it, it's really hard to take steps further, knowing that you're on safe ground and you're evidence-based.
This kind of accountability mechanism, could we ever have a proper global format that would work in tandem with the multitude of regulatory challenges that are out there, Julian? Or is that always going to be the unsolved problem?
I think we have to start from where we are and build out, and to the extent that other people, other companies see that what we're doing is valuable and useful for them and for their reputation and for trust levels and credibility, I think that's the place to start. But the companies we work with are global players, and so you have to think much beyond one country, one jurisdiction. You have to think in the round, in a global way.
Can I put the same question to you, Robert, if I may? Again, we have these public authorities that very much need to act when something goes wrong. And again, I mentioned earlier on Ireland, which is in theory hosting this event. we have got our regulator looking after most of the most significant players because they have the European headquarters based here. I mean, if that accountability mechanism doesn't work, can regulators act? Will there be sufficient resources for those regulators to act? And is that always going to be effectively the speed brake on any regulatory system that is in some way voluntary?
So firstly, as Chris emphasized, regulators will never get enough money to implement the bad old model in the 21st century. Secondly, however, I'm an optimist, and regulators will grow the habit of global positive comity. They will talk to each other, they will work with each other. And I think around the Internet Governance Forum, for example, there are huge opportunities for regulators and policymakers and certifiers to begin to socialize the sorts of messages that Julian is pushing so effectively. So I think, yes, there's space. And what you have to be able to demonstrate is that by doing this stuff together, regulators reduce their costs. And if by doing it together, what they are doing is working in a sort of a more 21st century way, looking at creating the incentives for ethical behavior, recognizing ethical behavior, giving benchmarks and challengeable certificates for ethical behavior, those things will, I think, over time, reduce the cost, increase the impact, and make the case for global cooperative solutions.
Incentives is a very good word, and kind of it goes to the heart of what we're talking about. This is a good question that came in from somebody who's watching somewhere in the world, and hello to them and thank you for their question. Why should online services expect one set of global rules when local offline competitors have to respect different rules? So the question of the level playing field, who wants to take that?
Can I jump right back in on that? I think the answer is that they can't. There are a couple of ways to go. Brad Smith was having a seminar just earlier yesterday, I think, with the European Commission, and he said, you know, we cut our costs by applying GDPR rules across the world. So that's one way to go, where companies actually do the heaviest lifting and then they satisfy everybody, and it's not the only example. The other approach is to say, if I'm an ethical business, I'm satisfying the core demands of every jurisdiction and putting myself in a trustworthy position. There may be add-ons, but I'm in a stronger position to challenge whether those add-ons are cost-effective, good regulation. So yes, every jurisdiction can always apply its special rules, but actually in this sort of area where human beings are similar across the world and the internet may pose similar threats across the world, good behavior looks the same as well.
Okay, Julian, same question to you if I can. Well, and I'll let you have the last word on this topic.
Sorry, remind me again.
The question was online, one set of rules, offline, which you're competing with, different set of rules.
It doesn't work, and as we move forward, these kind of huge differences between, say, old-fashioned broadcasting and new media, we can see the AVMSD directive extending out beyond a small number to YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and so on. So progress is happening. Can I just steal one extra 30 seconds of your time?
Go on.
To come back to the point that Christopher Hughes made about culture and trust. And we are at the moment, learning a lot more about how these companies we work with are managing the issues of moderation at scale every day. And one of the questions that we're really focusing on is about safer by design. But the interesting thing is not really, are the trust and safety teams talking about safer by design? Are they getting it? Are they communicating? Because you'd expect them to be doing that every day of the week. The interesting thing is, if you look at the product and the engineering areas and you say, is safer by design embedded in your area? Is it actually part of how you think of right at the start when you're designing new products and services, which they're doing the whole time? And that seems to me to go to Christopher Hughes' point about culture and trust,
absolutely.
And carrying it with you.
I agree, absolutely. And it's a very relevant point because I share a lot of cybersecurity seminars. And again, their entire ethos is there's no point in trying to bolt something on if it isn't at the heart of everything you're doing from the get-go. Julian, thank you very much for that. Julian Coles of the Internet Commission and Robert Madlin, the chairman and partner at FIPR. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. I'll allow you to turn off your cameras there and to enjoy the rest of the webinar as viewers. Rebecca unfortunately couldn't join us. Rebecca Newton, Head of Trust and Community, with super awesome. Regrettably, unfortunately, Zoom managed to kick her out and we couldn't get her back in. But Rebecca, we know you're watching and thank you very much for your contribution so far. Now, before we move to our next poll, our next panel, another little bit of a fun poll to see how you are feeling today, because we are trying to gauge global mood while on a Zoom call from Ireland, spreading out around the world. And again, it's to inform me just where your thought space is as we're listening to our speakers moving along. So if we can throw up our next poll, please, Uri. And the question on this one is, will big tech businesses take the lead, making digitalization a positive and trustworthy process? So that's very much fundamental to what we've been hearing from our panelists so far. So let's get the votes in. We'll give it a little while just to see what people think. Yes, it is already doing so. Yes, eventually, maybe if their shareholders tell them to, possibly if governments regulate them, and the outright answer of no. So it's interesting to see the votes coming in. Will big tech businesses take the lead, making digitalization a positive and trustworthy process? Is the carrot effective enough, or do we require the stick? Well, I think that is fairly clear from the people who have voted there. It has to be the shareholders, or it has to be the government regulating them. So not a huge appetite from people who are listening right now with the idea of digitalization being positive and trustworthy, with the businesses leading themselves. So thank you to everybody who participated in that. Shareholders, still the most important people in companies. Who would have thought it, eh? Moving on to our fourth panel now, ladies and gentlemen, and it's about shaping the future agenda. What coordinating actions are planned, and more importantly, what are required? Our speakers here, we have Yuping Chan, who is leading the digital cooperation team in the Office of the Special Advisor to the Secretary General at the United Nations. She's a Singaporean national. Yuping first posted to New York as a diplomat with the Singapore mission to the UN. Claire Burry is Director General in DG Connect with responsibility for regulatory aspects of the European digital single market. She's a barrister by training. She's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in the beautiful city of Bruges. Hopefully Claire can turn on her camera and join us as well. And while a visitor at the Oxford Internet Institute, Mark Bunting developed a concept of procedural accountability, which is central to the Internet Commission's work. He was appointed the Content Policy Director at Ofcom in 2019. He's responsible for developing the UK's regulatory model for online content and conduct regulation. Yuping and Mark, I can see you. Claire, I can't see you yet, but if you can turn your camera on, that would be great. The joy of doing these things in Zoom when we can't meet each other in person. Yuping, if I can go to you first of all. We heard from the Undersecretary General there, which was great to hear his thought process. How has the UN approached the issue of technology governance coordination, given, I suppose, that it is rather uniquely positioned being a global body?
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thanks to all for inviting us to speak here today. As USG Hochschild has said, I think the UN has sort of reached the space where it realizes that it can present itself as a platform for stakeholders to come together to talk about digital governance and internet governance and all these key issues that all the speakers have actually mentioned today. So part of what has been this drive towards digital cooperation at the United Nations is a process which has been very multi-stakeholder and very inclusive, conducted here at the United Nations over the last 2 or 3 years, resulting in a number of major reports that have come out from the United Nations. So for instance, last year, the Secretary General of the United Nations convened a high-level panel on digital cooperation with such luminaries as Jack Ma and Melinda Gates. He produced a report that was on the future of digital independence, interdependence, and just recently, the Secretary General himself also issued another report on giving out a roadmap for digital cooperation, where it highlights a lot of the issues that previous speakers were talking about. The need for instance, some form of internet cooperation, this idea that tech companies really have to be part of this partnership with both the member states as well as the governments in coming together to forge more productive relationships and partnerships to address a lot of the key issues facing us when it comes to digitization. So I would say the United Nations really pushing this forward.
The real challenge here is best laid plans lay in ruins globally at the moment because of what COVID-19 has done. How has that affected thinking at the United Nations on what might have been considered a roadmap to progress on something as important as this?
I think it's actually created a sense of urgency, a realization, set to say, at the United Nations that has only come a little bit more recently and to everybody else here, that digitization is a force that has to be reckoned with. So the COVID pandemic, the fact that now diplomats are forced to work virtually, that we cannot meet in person, that a lot of these meetings and a lot of the work must be done remotely, has made it very clear that we have to address technology in a more effective manner. So I think, if anything, the COVID pandemic has brought home the fact that the United Nations must tackle digital technology and more effectively manage technologies in such a way that we can realize the benefits, for instance, meeting remotely and continuing our work remotely while still addressing some of the harms. It also, I think, has brought home the fact that even though we can do this, there are a lot of people around the world, I think it's 3.6 billion, that remain unconnected to the internet. So as part of the work at the United Nations to bring the benefits of development to the masses, a lot of it has to do with addressing digital divides and making sure that those that don't have access to the internet still can benefit from this technology. And it has never been so stark as now in COVID, when people like us can meet and work remotely, but so many around the world in developing countries aren't able to do so.
And I suppose never waste a good crisis. And the fact that we have managed to get so many people to move online so fast, it doesn't help those who don't have access to the internet, but it does show us how the world can be an awful lot more connected. I mean, we are speaking from 3 different countries right now, and in a meaningful way. We should use the positives here.
Completely agreed. But again, it brings home the fact that even though we're connecting from 3 different countries, the bulk of the world remains unconnected. The fact that in these developed countries, for instance, less than 20% of the population actually have access to the internet or can get online, the fact that even among those that are connected, the divide between the people who have access to technology is very disparate depending on factors such as race, such as gender, and economic levels, is something that has to be addressed. So this is something that, again, COVID has brought home to the United Nations and is a call for greater cooperation in this space.
Mark Bunting of Ofcom, if I can bring you in at this point. Obviously, as a regulator, you've got a very specific role, a very important role in all of this. I'll take, you've been listening to what's been said before, so we'll come back to that in just a minute. But working with industry here is probably vital. You don't be the guy wielding the stick the whole time. There has to be some form of a carrot approach. How easy is it to work with industry?
Well, look, I think the environment has changed significantly over the last few years. Companies are much more alive to the risks on their platforms than they were 5 years ago or more. They are much more responsive to public concerns about those issues, and they've done a lot by way of transparency already. I think we are moving into a different phase now, which is, having had a prolonged debate about whether regulation was needed. That kind of debate has been settled, and most countries, certainly in Western Europe, are looking at different forms of regulation. And not only in Europe, you look to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, very significant efforts going into thinking about the right ways to regulate. So we don't yet know how the industry will respond to those regulatory initiatives. We have good conversations with the big platforms. We have good relationships with them. I think they welcome regulators that bring a professional approach. But there's clearly risks for companies as well. And I think how they and we handle the engagement over the next couple of years is going to be really important.
Again, you are the guy, you're I suppose you're the last man standing in terms of making sure that we as a society are protected. And that's probably, it's an unenviable position for you to be in, but you have a different set of rules to maybe what might happen in the United States. You, for now, have the same set of rules to what we have here in Ireland, but that might change in a couple of months' time. It's a moving target, and I'm not sure it's going to stop moving.
Yeah, well, look, I really hope we're not the last man standing. You know, I think it's characteristic of regulation for these very complex issues that a regulator, being the sort of final arbiter of what's acceptable or not, whether it's content on people's screens or whether it's the processes that companies use to handle harms, is quite an uncomfortable one for a regulator. Clearly, in extremis, we would decide whether a company's processes have been adequate to manage the problems that we see on their platforms, and there will be fines and sanctions available. But I think the important part of regulation in this area is going to be working with a much wider ecosystem of experts and organizations. You know, what we really want to try to create is an environment where platforms, government, regulators, civil society, experts, academics are forming a coalition of the willing to tackle some of these very intractable social and technological issues, such as those that different jurisdictions are now trying to regulate for. So it's much more of a partnership-based approach than the sort of last line of defense kind of approach.
And if I can come back to you on that, Yuping Chan, if I may, that would be brilliant. If we could get that level of coordination. You work at the United Nations, you know how blooming difficult that can be. Mm-hmm. How do we get to that position? How do we find a way that industry, academia, goodwill and good people come together to make sure that we get this right?
Yeah, well,
I'll give that to Yuping if I can, Mark.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Mm-hmm.
No problem. Thank you so much. I mean, actually, this is kind of ironic because today is actually UN Charter Day, where, you know, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations through the signing of the UN Charter. And in the Secretary General's remarks, this, I think it was this morning or yesterday, he actually said that, again, the United Nations can serve as a platform to bring everybody together. And the whole process of digital cooperation has been about bringing industry, civil society, NGOs, and governments to the table, putting them in the same process where we discuss all these key issues. So, for instance, we've perhaps come under some criticism at the United Nations for being too much living in our United Nations bubble without engaging with civil society and private sector in this particular way. But if you look at the roadmap for digital cooperation that we issue, it is very clear there that there is no way the United Nations and governments can make progress if they don't make sure to engage with all these stakeholders that you're talking about. So the United Nations as a whole is very committed to this multi-stakeholder approach. It'll take a while, I think, to sort of disprove the critics. And I think some of the speakers have already talked about some of the difficulties, but we at the United Nations at least are prepared to take this very first step to actually make sure that the process of internet regulation, of discussing these key issues when it comes to digitization and challenges, really will be one that includes all voices at the same table.
And again, I suppose the UN is one thing. Ofcom has a regulatory role in the United Kingdom, and you do regularly discuss with your counterparts around the globe, but how joined up is the thinking right now, Mark? Or is it still, we have our rules and you've got yours?
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. So there is European legislation which is coming into force now at different speeds in different member states, but the Audiovisual Media Services Directive includes regulation of video sharing platforms. That's the first time, I think I'm right in saying, that there will be pan-EU plus the UK regulation of video sharing platforms on the same basis. Now, we will have to work very closely with our counterparts, even though the UK is not going to be part of the EU anymore. We will have to work very closely because in the end, I think we all recognise that we will have more leverage by working together and where we can finding common standards than working apart. Having said that, there are clearly differences in national legal regimes which have to be recognised. You know, Germany has a very different regime around speech than the UK does, and of course the US has something completely different, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the big challenges in collaboration is to find where's the common ground and the areas in which we can take a consistent approach, and then how do we accommodate areas of difference within that. And that's a very active conversation.
Yeah, the common ground is always the common good, I suppose, isn't it, at the end of the day? And that's what everybody sets out to. Claire Burry, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you. Can you hear me? Oh, we just need to turn your microphone on. I think I should be able to do that. Hang on. We're nearly there. We're so close. Oh, I think I may have muted you again. I'll let you do this. This is why I'm not allowed to touch buttons. Try and unmute yourself again there, Claire.
Did that work now?
That did work. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I thought I had done something terrible and kicked you out, but good to see you've rejoined us here. We've been having a very interesting conversation about how this can be done through a form of joined up thinking. And if I can ask you, has Europe taken a bit of a lead in regulating this type of world? You know, we've got a lot of technologies coming down the line that would make your eyes water, blockchain, AI, things that even 5 years ago would have seemed the stuff of science fiction, and already they're becoming the stuff of science fact. So have we got a bit of an edge in Europe in getting ahead of those things, or are we going to play a game of catch up like we've been doing with everything else?
Well, I think obviously we'd like to think that we're getting a bit ahead of the game now in Europe. Huh? I mean, certainly, if you look at the agenda that we set out for the next 5 years, I think there are three principles which underlie that. The first is that technology should work for people. and respect European values rather than the other way around. That, I think, secondly, technology thrives on a fair and competitive economy, but that it has to be fair. And thirdly, that technology should support an open and democratic and sustainable society. So those are essentially the three principles now that are underlying. So I think that shows that there is definitely an ethical approach, I would say, to Europe now in terms of these issues. And if I could take maybe a couple of examples, I mean, you mentioned it yourself, Jonathan, the artificial intelligence. So what the Commission's been trying to do there is implement what we call a human-centric approach to AI. So we talk about having an ecosystem of excellence, which means that we'll actually be good at AI and we'll be better at AI and we'll put more money into AI. But at the same time, we need what we call an ecosystem of trust. So what does the ecosystem of trust mean? This means that we would have a system where AI is based on a regulatory foundation. Of course, we have to be very careful about how we do that in terms of getting the balance right, that we don't over-regulate. So we need proportionate regulation. But at the same time, this should be regulation which makes sure that AI complies with EU law and protects consumers and fundamental rights. So we know, for example, that gender bias in training data, which is used for recruitment, could lead to discrimination. So in those kind of situations, what we will be looking for is accountability and transparency in terms of the way that the AI is developed and better enforcement. And through the transparency and openness in terms of the way that the AI is developed, that it would be possible to actually check that EU law has been complied with.
Can I put the, like, again, I always think back to my youth when I expected artificial intelligence to be 6 foot tall and you know, serving me food of some kind, but that's not what AI has turned out to be. It's here, and you know, it's my phone, and it'll me talking to it, and whatever the AI is going to do there and elsewhere on the websites that I'm using, and so on and so forth. How difficult is it going to be to regulate AI when you have global actors in the space, and what the Chinese or the United States think is the right thing differs to what Europe thinks, and as a result we have got numerous regulations in the same way that we've different regulations right now. I mean, have we learned anything from the last couple of years as to how a global approach is needed, but one wasn't necessarily always forthcoming?
Well, I think, I mean, obviously we're working on the global basis as well. I mean, we're talking in particular to the Americans and to the Canadians about what their approach is. But I think, I mean, what we're looking to do in Europe is to actually set a regulatory standard. I mean, the obvious example which is cited is GDPR, of course. That GDPR has become the gold standard. I mean, it applies within Europe, but since companies have adjusted their systems to apply GDPR for the purposes of Europe, then they apply it in other parts of the world as well. So I think what's important is that we get that right balance in terms of what we're doing on AI, and that we don't try and over-regulate. And I think that's where the challenge is going to come, you know, to make sure that we get the fundamentals and that we have the accountability and the transparency and so on, and that we have good quality data that goes into the AI, but that we don't go over the top.
Can I just bring it back to, I'll ask each of you this question, but you, Ping Chan, if I can begin with you. The Internet Commission, you've got some of the best and brightest minds from around the world watching us right now. What role do you think that they can play, and more importantly, that their partners can play in forging this bright new future for regulation and making sure that we are all protected in the right way?
I think I've said it before, the UN is trying to be as inclusive as possible when it comes to digital cooperation, because we are mindful that member states and governments can't do it alone. So we really invite all of the partners that are present today, as well as the Internet Commission, to be part of the process that we're convening around the follow-up to the roadmap itself. So for instance, Claire just mentioned the importance of artificial intelligence. You'll see in the roadmap that we are proposing the establishment of an advisory body on artificial intelligence to the Secretary General. And we're in the process now of convening multi-stakeholder consultations that will actually go into the formulation of the terms of reference and the scope of this body. And we really look forward to hearing from all technical experts, as well as people around the world and different voices, particularly from the Global South, as to how best to scope the UN's approach to technology, to artificial intelligence and other areas. So really do welcome a contribution from all of you, particularly those who have actually this kind of expertise that is sorely lacking at the United Nations.
Claire, if I can ask, what the European Commission, what do you want from the Internet Commission and the influence that they can wield?
Well, I think what we need is input from the stakeholders, and we need input from industry. I think that's what's so interesting about the work that the Internet Commission has been doing with industry in terms of actually testing some of the principles. I mean, we've been doing a pilot with companies, testing the principles that we elaborated, the 7 principles which could be the basis of regulating AI, which are really principles, not their high-level principles. Huh? So I think the more that the Internet Commission can help us by testing those principles and actually giving us feedback in terms of what can work in practice and what works in the field, I mean, I think that can be very, very interesting. Yeah?
Okay, and Mark, same question to you, if we can. What do you want the guys who are watching around the world right now, what do you want them to contribute to the work that Ofcom is doing?
Yeah, well, I talked about the partnership agenda earlier. I think we're very conscious that we won't have the expertise or the resource to tackle the very significant challenges that online content poses to policy objectives within an organisation like Ofcom. And it'll be our role to find the right partners to work with to ensure that we deliver the right outcomes for consumers. So we are very much hoping that industry will support initiatives that enable us to develop solutions with the industry, including parts implemented by the industry, rather than Ofcom having to take all of these roles on itself. So the more that those industry forums can come together to present a united face that we can work with, the easier our job will be and the better the outcomes will be.
Well, technically, I'm speaking to 3 effective police officers within the space, and I have to say you're the nicest enforcers I've ever met in all the years that I've been doing these things. Yiping Chan, Office of the Special Advisor for Digital Cooperation at the United Nations, Claire Berry, Deputy Director General with DG Connect of the European Commission, and indeed Mark Bunting of Ofcom. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll leave you turn your cameras off and go back and enjoy the rest of the presentation. Thank you very much for joining us from around the world. Let's bring this event towards its conclusion, and thank you so much for your attention throughout. Thank you to those who've been sending in questions. I see there's lots of people interacting, and questions are being answered live down below as well. But I'd ask Mary Keane Dawson to join us. She is the Group Chief Executive of the influencer marketing agency Takumi. She is a member of the Internet Commission's Advisory Board, lots of experience in the world of digital media. She's led leadership roles at the likes of Dentsu, WPP, and Ogilvy, which I always find that one hard to say. Ogilvy and Matter. Ogilvy, I'm so close. Mary, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm really well. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I must say that I found this seminar to be encouraging and positive and extremely constructive, which is a great thing, because we need that right now. Absolutely, in every sense. Look, let's go back on each of the topics that we've been discussing throughout the course of the afternoon. The key social impacts and challenges resulting from digitalization. And again, as I said, I'm the useful idiot here. I'm not in this space. You guys are. But the second I started speaking to that panel, I started thinking about my kids. I started thinking about how my children interact almost constantly, well, at least according to the amount of data that my house is using, online. And they're going to be the ones who inherit the system that we are trying to, fix and not break at the moment. What are the key challenges that you take from what our panel was telling us earlier? Well, I think it's, first of all, I think it was really interesting what Sonia Livingston was saying about looking at the world through the lens of children and young people, because they are digital by default. And it's also really interesting that ourselves, Takumi, Vice, and Match, 3 big businesses, 3 organizations that have humanity and also work with young people and young adults and so forth, so on and so forth. Although Match obviously is not exclusively young people, but is that we have humanity at the center of our businesses, right? Because we deal with human beings. Although we're also technologists and we all have technological solutions. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting about the social impact of this is that the people who are making the rules up and are talking and designing the regulation are actually from the analog world in the vast majority of instances. And I think that incorporating and being inclusive to actually have the end user and the early adopters and the people who are the first ones to, you know, lead the charge in for this revolution that we're currently experiencing. Because in the last 12 weeks, we have seen a behavioral change, which under normal circumstances in the digital world would take at least 3 years. And that is the seismic tsunami of consumption of social media. I mean,
well, I did an event yesterday with a group of HR professionals. If you think you're spooked, can you imagine how those guys feel about how their world has changed in the last 12 weeks? You talk about the importance of relating it back to the user, and that's hugely significant. I'm a huge fan of the guy or girl in the room, the person who's sitting in the corner, listening to everything that's going on, and finding the voice to say, wait a minute, have we thought this through? Have we thought of the implications for this? Are technology companies getting better at that, at you know, identifying what the guy or the girl in the room might raise as a potential problem before it becomes a problem with actual users?
I think it really depends. I mean, you know, we're in a very interesting period in history. We all know that. I'm stating the obvious, I know, but you know, the fact of the matter is that it really tends to be disruptors in technology that identify the elephants in the room, to your point. And usually they connect, you know, when they're successful, they connect with consumers. And that, yeah, and I think TikTok is a perfect example of that, you know, because it's a completely user-generated content, you know, platform. And yet, you know, it's compulsive, it's addictive, it's what have you. But it's also the place where now, you know, Black Lives Matter and protest movements and people, you know, from all manner of different ethnicities, gender, you know, identification, sexualities, and so on and so political beliefs and what have you, have finding a voice, and they're finding an audience, and you know, so therefore they're now really leading in many respects the agenda that's being set out there, because you know they're making themselves heard. And so in a strange sense, I mean, you know, by kind of building, you know, and recognizing the power you can actually give to the audience through technology, you know, they kind of take the charge and they lead the field. And I think that's been an incredible, you know, change that we've witnessed.
Well, as a guy who works in radio, as you can imagine, I'm extremely worried by TikTok because it puts me out of a job. But that's fine. There's another generation or two to go before it becomes endemic.
I wouldn't say that. I can't see you ever being out of a
job. when we talk about organizations adapting, are they getting faster at doing it? Is that a fact? I mean, the response times that we would see from somebody identifying a problem to solving it, or you know, getting ahead of something, traditionally companies would be quite slow in moving. We don't have that luxury anymore. Are they getting better at responding quickly?
Well, again, I would say that the agility factor tends to rest with those who are, you know, using technology to basically solve complex problems, rather than, you know, letting technology purely make all the decisions for them. I think large organizations, the platform and the big, you know, tech platforms, they still take their time in making decisions and making change happen, because to the point that many of the panelists today made, that, you know, there are different needs, different cultural and different social and political requirements in the variety of markets that they work in. And of course, that does mean that, you know, one size doesn't fit all. But I think, you know, to the point that Jared was making regarding how they've applied, you know, an ethical and you know, corporate governance framework for their digital activity, and they've been flexible about how they've, you know, to recognise that there's social and cultural differences. I think that's a really hugely positive piece, and something that we can all learn from. And I think that's, you know, there are big challenges though for the big technology platforms such as Google and Facebook.
Absolutely. A question from the virtual floor, if I may, Mary. There are lots of stakeholders to whom business can be accountable. How much difference does a company choosing a specific stakeholder to be the focus of their accountability strategy to make the outcomes of that effort? Is there such a thing as focusing on the right or wrong?
Well, I mean, you know, right or wrong is really subjective to a certain extent, but, you know, in terms of like the nuance of right and wrong. But fundamentally, we're talking about rights here. And I think that, you know, the final panel really did hit it on the nail on the head about this huge disparity between the power you have when you have digital capability and that you are, you know, and you've got the knowledge and the expertise and you've got the ability to use it, you know, to basically access everything at the speed of light. And to those who do not have that, right? And that disparity, you know, is an injustice to not only those societies, but to, you know, humankind. And that's something that we, you know, the UN, the EU, and you know, the Ofcom, for example, and the Internet Commission are absolutely trying to address. But fundamentally, the big platforms have to play because they have more power in most cases than governments in terms of actually impacting on behaviours.
And therein lies the challenge. We did hear that, you know, the Internet Commission has been speaking with some companies about good practice and trying to establish what the best practice is. It's a very interesting idea, because I'm not sure I've ever sat down and read any kind of documentation that tells me we know some companies are better than others, but to delve into the why, I mean, that is going to be something that will be very important to hold up as a standard.
I agree, but I think is going to be really instructive is this Internet Commission report, their first accountability report, which comes out, I think, later this year. And, you know, those case studies where they have actually, you know, scrutinized and you know, delved deeply into how you know, those frameworks work within those organizations, what it tells us and what the key learnings are, I think will then set the bar for what is best practice, the recommendations, of course, as well, but what is best practice. And the more that companies adopt this as the approach to how they're doing business, then, to my mind, that makes complete sense, because it was mentioned again many times during the panels that, you know, purely fining companies is simply, you know, not the solution, and it clearly isn't working in the most effective way. What does matter is when sentiment turns against you, and the sentiment of the public and the sentiment of your, you know, your audience is the most powerful sentiment of all. So as we've seen, you know, with various advertisers pulling out of Facebook over the last, you know, few days, and pulling their advertising, you know, that hurts. And that hurts a lot more because their audience are telling them not to advertise on Facebook.
I was just going to say, it's a form of peer pressure in many ways, except it's not the peer companies, it's the peer users, the people who are on the far side going, well, I've seen what you're good for, but I've also seen what you're bad at. And as a result, I'm going to punish you or do something that will result in your platform struggling. So is that the way that we could move forward in an ethical fashion, that we see that companies, and there may be failures or there may be issues that arise that cause platforms to struggle? Does it take an act like that, and I suppose the act of the end user, to make this work in terms of proper self-regulation?
I think that absolutely the audience and the end user fundamentally have, you know, as a collective, they have the most power, right? And if more and more businesses, and I think, you know, disruptive businesses do this, and I think they are doing this because they're adopting ethical frameworks as a part and parcel of how they do business. And that manner, and they also are saying, you know, we might get it wrong, but if we do, you know, we'll admit it and we'll say we got it wrong and we'll try and fix it. And I think that's one thing that, you know, we should never, this is an evolving area because technology moves at the speed of light. We as an industry, as an ecosystem, have a responsibility to be flexible and say we're going to be flexible. But that in and of itself is actually a commitment that we're making. And that commitment, I think, resonates deeply with an audience that feel that they're being shortchanged and that their data is being stolen from them and they kind of didn't realize it. And then all this money was being made out of it and they didn't get any of it. That kind of stuff is now it's no longer just accepted because the values that you represent and the values that you do in business are fundamentally the things that your audience need to identify with. And I think we've seen that repeatedly.
And that brings us back to the group that we have with us here today, the stakeholders, everybody who's watching and what they can do. So we need a call to action, Mary. We need something to take away with us today. What is that? I mean, I'm always going on about no matter who's in charge, no matter how important they think their role is, no matter what role they have, they're only ever a custodian for what comes after. And if we don't get this right, the next generation, the kids, those digital natives, as we call them, they're the ones who are going to be fixing our mess. So let's not leave a mess for them to fix. What do we need to do, and what do people need to take away from this event today?
Well, we must stop just using words as empty solutions. We must take action. And I would recommend to every business owner or anyone who buys products from brands or works with technology companies is to ask what is your ethical framework? What is your, how do you deal with these issues that are moral and economic and actually affect society and culture in such a huge and dramatic way? And and we've seen this with Black Lives Matter, and we're seeing it repeatedly with disenfranchised individuals and people who are outside of the technology. They're not empowered by technology. How are we going to bring them in? Because we can't just leave it to government. The UN can lead the way and they can really set the agenda. But fundamentally, we all have to play a part in this.
It's funny because we have a system of policing, and we've got people around the world. Our system of policing in this country for the regular police, which are called the Garda Síochána, is policing by consent. So the police don't have to feel as if they have to interfere in your lives on a regular basis, but if you break the rules, they're going to be there. Sure. The internet should be like that, shouldn't it? That everybody has an agreed collective set of rules that uphold the ethical standards, but we do need some level of enforcement in case somebody steps out of line. Would that be a fair assessment of what we need to get to?
I think there has to be consent. I mean, I think that's inevitable. And I think that what Claire Berry was saying from the EU around, having, an actual, kind of flexible regulatory system, because, that's one of the things that technology has done is it's brought about ethical questions that we've never really had to ask ourselves before, right? Because data whenever was the data monetized at the scale it currently is? Never. This is a first in history. So it's raised ethical and philosophical questions which we've never had to ask ourselves before. So I think there does have to be some flexibility in terms of how regulation works. But you're right, it has to be by consent. And that will only happen if there has to be a constant debate, and there has to be constant reflection on how we are behaving and what we're doing.
As I had expected, I have yacked on far too much, and I forgot to ask the questions that people around the world are asking. So I'm going to go through them very quickly. A quick fire round, Mary, if you will. Mike says, sentiment leading to responses is a good start, but how do consumers get redress when they deserve it? I mean, he's speaking specifically about e-commerce maybe needing a code or some form of backup regulation. That's one area. Discuss.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the Wild West has to, we have to stop this. E-commerce is now the biggest way of retail, of selling anything. Direct to consumer is absolutely the way forward. We're seeing it everywhere. This whole, as I said, in 12 weeks, we've seen 3 years worth of economic change. There has to be a regulatory agenda and best practice that we all have to adopt, and there has to be some policing around that for sure.
Very quickly, Nick Sieber, good evening to you. Nick, listening to the panelists in the round, I wonder, is there an opportunity for internet governance to be wrapped into a broader theme of societal good and sustainability akin to the Sustainable Development Goals? Any view?
I totally agree. And I think that Yu-Ping Chan was actually referring to that when she was talking about what the UN is currently doing with its agendas around initiatives around digitization and the goals of digitization. They have to be aligned with the goals of the UN. Absolutely. So that's sustainability is not just an issue, which is of course a massive issue for the Earth, but it's also an issue for digital, because AI uses huge amounts of energy. Quantum computing is like going to be an absolute revolution in terms of the power it will consume. These all have an impact on the planet, and they have an impact on society.
Okay, and one very quick one, and I'm conscious the time is against us. Regulation tends to be national, but the internet needs a collective set of rules. At present, there's competition between regulators at national sector and international level. And isn't that where this is all going to fall apart? If we keep playing by different sets of rules and there isn't at least a global standards of decency and ethics, it's not going to work.
Well, I think that will only come by, by the audience putting pressure on, there's nothing worse than stop buying unethical products, as a lot of brands have found to their cost.
To their extreme cost. Mary, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for pulling all the strands together on what's been a very interesting afternoon. Mary Keane-Dawson from Takumi, have a very good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you turn your camera off. And folks, that brings us to the end of this symposium. And it has been, look, very educational for me. As I said, this is not my area, but hey, guess what? I'm a user and I benefit from the type of regulation or the type of ethics that go into everything on all of the devices that I use, that my family use. So this is a conversation that's worth having. And it was fantastic to hear from all of our panelists, everybody who took part in the question and answer sessions, even down to the polls that we were running across the course of this webinar. Everything is going to be recorded and put up on the web, so you'll be able to go back to this later on. You'll be able to share with other people who may have the interest as well, and the details will all be on emails that you would have gotten earlier on. On behalf of the International Network for the Delivery of Regulation at Oxford Technical University, at Oxford University, the Technical University in Dublin, and the London School of Economics and Political Science, thank you so much for attending this Digital Technology Sector Symposium. We hope you took as much from it as we did. Wherever you are in the world, do stay safe. Next time, we will bring you to Dublin for the traditional pint. But for now, from me, Jonathan Healy, stay safe and good evening.